Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Joy Fellowship. So we're 1 week away from starting our Back to School series. As I was going through this lesson, I thought I was going to be able to split this chapter up into 2 parts, and I decided I was going to make it 3. So we're going to do 3 parts. That'll take us into next week, and then we will take a little hiatus or break. It means break from the Gospel of John, and we will go into our Back to School series where I will attempt, anyway, to answer all the questions that Judith put in.
Judith put in a lot.
She did, and that is good. She put in some very thoughtful questions, as did others. So we will do that. So when I was in college, I had a good friend of mine. In fact, he was probably my best friend in school, besides Marcy. His name was John, and he happened to be blind. Now, he was probably the most fun-loving, gregarious type of individual you would ever meet. His blindness was a result of complications with type 1 diabetes, or diabetes, if you're Wilford Brimley. And so, unlike the character that we're going to be looking at, the person in our story today, and yes, last week, he had his vision for the first part of his life and then went blind, and by the time I met him, he had absolutely no vision whatsoever. We had the same major in college, so we went to a lot of the same classes. And we became very good friends, and we would do a lot of things together. And most of the time, I would act as his guide. I would walk with him around campus, and he would hold on to my elbow and know where to go and where steps were and stuff like that by me just being slightly out in front of him. That was normal for us. What wasn't normal is when he would hand me his sunglasses and his cane, I would get behind him and I would grab his elbow, and we would start to walk across campus. And by just turning his elbow gently with my hand, just a little bit, I was able to tell him what was coming up, when he needed to turn, when there were steps, things like that, without a lot of verbal prompts. Now, everybody on campus knew he was blind. Now, unfortunately, he never got to see what the looks were like, but the looks from people were just absolutely astonished because they knew he was blind, but he was leading me around. It was hilarious. So I'll tell another story on him next week, but yeah, we'll leave it at that. In modern days, there's a lot of technology, a lot of things that an individual that has vision problems can use to adapt, whether it be a cane or a seeing eye dog, whether it be some braille or some other type of technology. There are different ways that an individual can adapt and can function in society. During the first century, this was not the case. And for the gentleman that we're in our story who was born blind, there would have been nothing for him in society whatsoever. There would have been no job that he could hold. There would have been no function that he could do in society other than to sit on the street corner with a cup and beg. And so that's where we first meet him, or that's where Jesus first meets him and encounters him. Sitting outside the temple, begging for a little bit of sustenance, a little bit of money, so that he can buy some food, that he can pay his rent or whatever he needed to do. And that was all that he had. Quite likely he still lived with his parents. His parents will come into the story by the end of the story today. But in the first century, that was he, as an individual with a disability, especially being blind, and especially having been blind from birth, he never was able to see anything. And so he was relegated to being the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. And last week we talked about this. The disciples and Jesus came by. They saw him sitting there, and the disciples asked the question, who sinned? Now, I chose that as the title of these three messages, but it really isn't, but it will come into play next week again. That same question, that same idea, that whenever there's a disability, whenever there's a problem, whenever there's an illness or an injury or a birth defect like this man had, being blind from the womb, it was in that day and age, and still to this day, it is seen as some type of judgment on sin, either in that person's life or in their parents' life or something of that nature. And we've talked about that before. That is just utter nonsense. And that's exactly what Jesus says. And that's exactly what we talked about last week. And that Jesus is saying, look, it wasn't his parents, it wasn't him.
It was that I could do the work.
It was just so that God could be glorified. Now, that doesn't mean that God caused him to be blind so he could wait around to heal him. But God knew that in the fullness of time for him, Jesus would come and would heal him. So we pick up the story in verse 6. After he said these things, he spit on the ground, made some mud from the saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. His neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, isn't this the one who used to sit begging? Some said he's the one, others said no, but he looks like him. He kept saying, I am the one. So they asked him, then how were your eyes open? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, go to Siloam and wash. So when I went and washed, I received my sight. Where is he? They asked. I don't know, he said. So recently I had a short but discussion online with a friend of mine about this idea, this juxtaposition of faith and action, faith and works, obedience. And he had said something and I kind of took exception with it, and I had kind of made a correction, and he came back stronger, and at that point I figured this isn't worth fighting over. But it's this idea of how do you understand faith and action? How do you understand this concept of faith? James talks about it. He says, you know, you believe that you have to have faith to be saved. I say, show me your faith by what you do. And that's kind of where I come down on this, is that Christ calls us to obedience. But the only way we have the power to obey is if we have faith in him. So faith is necessarily, in the way I interpret it, a prerequisite for obedience. You can't really obey unless you believe. The problem is, in a lot of places, it's kind of hard to believe unless you obey as well. So the two go kind of hand in hand. Now, the people around him saw that he suddenly was able to see. And so they're asking him a bunch of questions. If you had a friend or an acquaintance of yours, I doubt very many of these people would necessarily be called what you or I would consider friends, because he probably didn't have a lot of friends being blind. People probably kept their distance, except to drop a few coins in his cup. And so they're asking him a bunch of questions. I mean, I think I would too. The problem is they don't ask him the questions that I want answers to. They're asking him, okay, how did this happen? Who did it? What I want to know, what I would like to know from him is, what were you thinking when Jesus spit on the ground and made a pool of mud and then smeared it on your face?
Yeah.
You know, what were you thinking on that walk down to the pool? Understand that the pool was about a half a mile away, and he had to make his way a half a mile in order to get to the pool and wash his face. And the whole time he's going down there, he's still as blind as he ever was. I want to know what's going through your mind on that walk down there. Was somebody helping him down that way? Or was it just so familiar to him, having begged in this particular spot for a long time? Was that route familiar enough to him that he could make his own way down?
Well, by faith, not by sight.
Yeah, he was walking by faith. But he went to the pool, and he had every opportunity to just throw in the towel and say, this is nuts. I'm just going to go home, wash my face, and be done with this. Why should I go down to the pool? We don't know if the pool was closer than his house or where he was living or what the situation was, but in my mind, those are the questions I want answers to. What were you thinking? Now, this whole passage kind of reminds us of a passage in 2 Kings chapter 5. A Syrian official by the name of Naaman had contracted leprosy, which was a skin disease that basically was a death sentence back then. It meant that you were an outcast, you couldn't be around people. It was highly contagious, at least it was thought to be, and so you separated people who had it. And he was told by a Hebrew slave, a little girl, that there was a prophet in Israel who could help him. So he went to see the prophet. And he came prepared with money and everything else that he figured he would need to get this prophet to listen to him. And the prophet told him, go down to the Jordan River and take a bath. Dip in the water 7 times. And he left that encounter with the prophet. The prophet didn't even offer to go with him. Just told him what to do. And Naaman was like, why would I even want to do this? The Jordan River is muddy. It is gross. It is just one of the worst rivers in the area. And I don't want to go down there. I can go back to Syria, and we've got plenty of pools with bright, clean water. I can take a bath anytime I want. And his servant who was with him said, sir, I don't understand this, but if the prophet had asked you to do some really difficult task, like slay 20 lions or do something really ambitious, you would think it was an appropriate action to do to get the blessing that he was offering. So why won't you do this simple thing like dipping in the water 7 times? I just don't get it. So Naaman decides, okay, we got to go by the Jordan anyway. Let's stop and I'll do it. And he does. And guess what? God heals him. We have this information on this other story where Naaman really had second thoughts about doing what God had asked him to do in order to get the blessing that he had been promised. With this man in our story in John, we don't get that interaction with him. We don't get the behind the scenes stuff. I wish John would have tracked him down when he was writing his gospel and said, hey, look, I got some questions for you. Because as we will see from his interactions with Jesus afterwards, it really appears that this man actually put his faith in Christ. But he has enough faith and enough understanding of who Jesus is to do what Jesus asked him to do. And he goes down to the pool, washes his face, the mud comes off, and he opens his eyes and he can see. Beyond that, the real miracle is he could make sense out of what he was seeing. It wasn't until, I think it was in the 17 or 1800s, that a surgeon was able to actually do corrective surgery on a child that had been born blind. And that child spent a lifetime trying to understand what it was he was looking at. Because the idea of seeing objects, seeing people, seeing buildings, seeing trees, all of that was so foreign to him that his brain never fully adapted to vision, even though his eyesight had been given back to him. But this man receives his sight, and he begins to interact with the people around him. But I really have to think that there were probably moments, at least, on that walk down to the pool where he had to be second guessing that whole situation.
Yeah.
Here he is, he's got the mud on his eyes, people are looking at him funny. Well, he can't know that because he can't see them, but they're trying to figure everything out. But he does what he's asked to do. His faith was strong enough that it took the step, even though he didn't see the answer or the miracle until the very end of the step. Another thing I think this story highlights is the incredible creativity of God.
Yeah.
If you look at all the different miracle stories throughout the four Gospels, very few of them are done the same way. There are a couple of instances where Jesus uses mud. This is one of them. There are some other instances where Jesus just speaks the word and a person's healed. There's one instance where Jesus doesn't even know he's healing somebody, and they just reach out and touch the hem of his garment, and they're healed. I think it highlights to me the incredible creativity that God has. It also gives me a sense of caution in that the more I listen to people's stories about their encounters with God and their encounters with Jesus, whether that's their first encounters or encounters that they have with him, 20 years after walking with him, there is just an incredible diversity of the way God deals with people. He knows what that person needs. And quite possibly, he knew that this man needed that walk. He needed that time to be alone with his own thoughts, to wrestle through what he was doing, to come to the conclusion that he was going to do what Jesus asked him to do. The other thing that really touches my heart when I read this story is the very end of that passage, where they ask him, okay, where is Jesus now? What's going on? Why, where is he? And the man has a very simple and a very honest answer. I don't know. Huh? What you talking about, Willis?
Yeah.
It's okay not to have the answers. Now, this man is going to be in for it. These are just his so-called friends, right? These are the people that he has been around every day. Neighbors that knew him, maybe lived next door to him or lived next door to his parents. Not really people I would call friends, but we'll use that term for now just for lack of anything better to use. And then there were the people who saw him every day, walked by and maybe threw a coin or two into his cup, or maybe walked by and turned their nose up because they figured he was a deadbeat sinner. That's why he was blind, and so now he was getting what he deserved. But these were the people who started asking him questions. And the one thing that they were saying is, look, you can't be that man because he was blind. We knew he was blind. He's been blind ever since he was born. There is no way that any of this makes sense. That you say you went down and washed some mud off your eyes and suddenly you can see, and you're walking around here, strutting around like nobody's business because now suddenly you can see. We just don't buy it. Half the people thought, well, he's just somebody that looks like him, maybe a twin brother or something that we never knew he had, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Jesus, so they do what any self-respecting Jewish man would do. They went and they brought him to the Pharisees, to the Jewish elders. So we'll pick up the story in verse 13. They brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. The day that Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. Do you think Jesus knew better? Or was that part of his plan? I have to think it was part of his plan. Then the Pharisees asked him again how he had received his sight. And he tells them the same story. He put mud on my eyes, and he told them, I washed and I can see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a sinful man perform such signs? And there was division among them. I've got to wonder if it wasn't like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus that were on that one side saying, how can this man do these things? Sounds an awful lot like what Nicodemus said to him in John chapter 3, doesn't it? What do you say about him since he opened your eyes? He's a prophet, he said. The Jews did not believe this about him, that he was blind and received his sight, until they summoned his parents of the one who had received his sight. They asked them, is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How then does he see? We know this is our son, and we don't know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him as the Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. This is why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So I probably needed to do this in 4 parts. I'll try to get through this section as quickly as I can. We see a couple of things here. First, they ask the man, and he gives them the same answer he's been giving. And why is he giving them this answer? Quite simply because it's the truth. This is what he knows. This man made some mud, he put it on my eyes, he told me to go wash, and now I can see. That's it. Yeah. It's as simple as that. That's all I know about the situation. I didn't talk to him for a long time. I didn't see him afterwards. This is just what happened.
Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you.
And so the Jewish leaders decide to call his parents in. And they ask his parents 3 questions. Is this your son? Was he really born blind? And how is it that he now can see? Now, the parents are very willing to answer the first 2 questions. Yeah, he's our son. We know that. We were there when he was born. Yes, he was born blind. We know that. We were there when he was born. But what about the 3rd question? You have to ask him. We weren't there. Now, part of this is that they are afraid. There's already been enough controversy with Jesus and enough thought and talk about Jesus being the Messiah that they're afraid that if they confess that Jesus healed him, then they will have to admit that he's the Messiah and that they will get kicked out of the synagogue, which is a big deal. In the 1st century, for a Jewish individual, the synagogue was life. That's everything you did was centered around the synagogue. And if you were kicked out, that meant you couldn't talk to people, you couldn't be around people, not even your family, your friends, nobody. Now, sometimes they were kicked out for 30 days, sometimes they were kicked out for a little bit longer, and sometimes they were just permanently kicked out forever. We don't know exactly what they're talking about here because it doesn't say specifically, but we know it was a big deal and that his parents were afraid. So they said, look, he's of age. Ask him. And it depends on which source you look at, but that idea that he's of age might be referring to the point where a Jewish boy would be considered a man, which is about 13 or 14, or it could be as late as in his 30s before he was considered a man to be able to testify in court. Different references give different ages. So somewhere between 15 and 30 years, this man has been blind, and now he can see. And so the parents say, hey, talk to him, because we're not going to get into that. So as we look at these two passages as a whole, what we see is that this man had an encounter with Jesus, and it begins him on a journey. And the moment he has an encounter with Jesus, other people are starting to ask questions. They're starting to want to know answers. And he gives them the best answers he's got. And a lot of times that's the way it is with us. I don't care if you have just started walking with Jesus or if you have been walking with Jesus for 20, 30, 40 years. Somebody's going to come up to you and say, hey, what about this where it says in the Bible, Jerry just did that to me today. What about this passage in the Bible? What does that mean? Somebody is going to come up and ask you a question. Sometimes you're going to have an answer. You're going to say, oh yeah, I studied that, or Charlie talked about that 2 weeks ago in Joy Fellowship, and here's the answer. Sometimes you're just going to have to say, you know what? I don't got a clue. Jerry and I were talking about the Trinity, and I told him, I said, the minute you get a really good explanation of the Trinity, give it to me because I don't have one. I have heard a lot of really insightful explanations of it. All of them eventually start to fall apart because there is only one Trinity, and that is God. And there is no one else, nothing else that we can point to and say, this is what the Trinity is like. We can get glimpses of it in different things in nature, but it's always just a little bit corrupted, always just a little bit not quite up to speed. And so I am very content with saying, you know what? That's something, when I get to heaven, I am going to spend the first 1,000 years studying that. Probably not, but that, I mean, I can apprehend it. I do not understand it. The Bible is pretty clear that you have a God that is 3 persons, 1 being. How that works, I don't understand it. I've listened to a lot of people, some people online, that are very, very intelligent,